So while I've got a little bit of time tonight, and after the funeral yesterday, I'd like to take a short little bit of time, have an apple juice, and sit and reminisce a little bit. Just think about what Callum had achieved for me. Because ultimately, Callum had believed that I could be something, and I didn't believe that. So I'd like to take the next short little bit of time, however long this takes, just to reminisce a little bit and just to think about how I've got to this stage, because ultimately Callum was a big part of that. So for those that don't know, I'm Adam, and my entire childhood life was kind of based around cars. I grew up normal everyday family, and I probably should have been tested for some form of ADHD or autism or something of that description, because from about 8 to 10 years old, and even younger before then, I spent a lot of my time relatively on my own building stuff. Used to spend a lot of time in the garage when I was a kid, and for my Christmas I used to get little circuit boards and I would sit and solder them up, and that was my happy place. I grew up in the garage soldering stuff, making stuff. And once I got a little bit older, I'd had a first kind of play with an old Triumph Tiger Cub, and I'd always wanted a motorbike. And my parents thought, that's a terrible idea, but we can get him a car. So my first car was a Volkswagen Polo, and immediately I wanted to, show the internet the things that I'd done to it. So it started off as just a old 1 litre, nothing particularly exciting, and then it got a 1.6 and it got motorbike carbs, and it got tuned by me on the road, and it was bum dynoed. Because I was a student at the time, I couldn't afford for it to go on a dyno, so it used to just be twist the dizzy, listen to it, how does it sound, and then take it out on the road and how does it feel. And that was great. And I remember the first winter that we had, my old man had said, you need to go out and you need to practice how to do a handbrake turn. And that lasted about 10 minutes, and very shortly after I'd put it into a fence. So it came back and we had to straighten the chassis legs out with a big mash hammer. And at the time I wanted to fit electric windows because it was so poverty, it didn't even have electric windows. And everybody on the internet said, you can't do that, that's impossible, it needs to be spec'd from the factory. And nothing's impossible. Everybody needs to remember this. If a man or a woman has made it, we can make it too. And that was one thing my old man had always said. He said, if somebody's built it, you can take it to bits. And that always stuck with me. So I wanted to fit electric windows, and I managed to do that. And because I was poor and I was on a student wage, all I had was Ethernet cable. So it was Ethernet cable between the two doors, and eventually that broke and blah, blah, blah. And for my 21st birthday, I got a Mark IV Golf, and that came around. It was reasonably well timed. The Polo eventually blew up because I put too much timing into it, and it eventually blew the engine up. So then I got a Mark IV Golf. I don't know why I wanted a Mark IV Golf, but it was my ideal car at the time. And I got this grey 5-door Mark IV Golf, and it wasn't long before I'd already bought a 3-inch exhaust, and I'd paid for somebody to tune it, and I'd started to modify it in that way. And I remember the first time it got tuned, I always remember watching the guy thinking, I could do that. I can use a laptop. So then after it had left, once it had been tuned, I started to learn how to do it myself. And that became just a repeat of the Polo. It was take it out, get some logs, get some data, see how it runs, and then squeeze more and more out of it until the engine blew up. And then I put another engine in it, and then that one blew up. And I think by the time I was finished, it had done 10, 12 engines, something like that. And eventually I'd met my wife and we'd got a house, and it got to the point that I had to be sensible and I had to buy a normal everyday car. So I'd always wanted an old BMW estate. So I got an E39 estate and I delayed that. And I'd bought a VR6 because my plan was to reshell the old 20 valve, and it was just to stick a VR6, and then it was going to have a turbo, but it would still be front wheel drive. And someone that I do a lot of immobiliser deletes for, that kind of thing, he'd reached out and he said, Adam, I've just purchased a 4Motion car, but I've ultimately just purchased it for the gearbox, so the rest of the car's going in the bin. So I took the 4Motion shell off him, I gave him the gearbox that I had because I bought an engine and gearbox to stick in the front wheel drive one. And I spent the next couple of years building it up to be a VR6 turbo. And, you know, from humble beginnings, I don't have a lot of money, so it was the cheapest, Chinesiest turbo, and it was all homemade oil lines. And I always remember thinking at some point I'll need a form of Haldex controller. And at the time, or shortly after that, there was a chap on GitHub and Nefmoto, the tuning site that I was on, and he'd released the code for a Gen 1 Haldex controller. And that's right up my street, the whole community involvement, being part of forums, and learning how to build stuff yourself. So I'd taken one of his Haldex controllers, I'd built one up, and I'd put it into the Golf. And at the time I maybe had, you know, a couple of hundred followers on Instagram. Wasn't really a particularly big thing. And that video went surprisingly viral, because I now had, you know, an OEM into DIY Haldex controller. And I remember shortly after that, my wife and her brother we'd all sat round, we'd came round, I can't remember why we were round at my flat, and Callum, I guess, believed in me, and he said, Adam, you should really sell all these things. And I remember at the time thinking, well, nobody's going to be interested. It's all, in my head, it's just this like-minded, you know, I'm too cheap to spend money on really expensive products, and I'd rather spend the time and effort developing it myself. Now, it might end up in the long haul costing me more than it would to just go out and buy, you know, one that was off the shelf. But to me, building cars isn't about, you know, anybody can open their wallet and pour thousands of pounds into whatever chassis they want, and they can have something, you know, special and fast at the end of it. But to me, it's all about the process. It's all about learning new skills, and you know, at the end of it, you can say, well, I built that. And I guess that was, you know, what always was, it was always a big part of my kind of growing up. And I think Callum appreciated that. So we'd sat around the old flat on the floor, and we went through all the ideas of the different things that I could sell, and they're hidden in the website today. There's poo bag holders, because my wife's a dog walker, and I'd modelled up a poo bag holder to sit in the back of our van. And there's loads of little stuff that was just, it was ultimately crap, but, you know, it was to try and demonstrate that there was things that people would be interested in. And I didn't particularly believe in what Callum was saying. I didn't think it would come to fruition. I always thought it would just be me and my ideas. And Callum went home that night, and he'd set up a website, and he'd spent a lot of time on Shopify making all of the, you know, the products that we had to offer, and starting to kind of firm them out. And that was his driver for years. And between the three of us, you know, we all still, to this day, we all still have full-time jobs. Sadly, Callum's no longer with us anymore, but we all still have full-time jobs. I come home at night. This is a Saturday night at 20 to 8. This is the only time that I get to do things like this. So Callum believed in me, and he thought that, you know, this could be the next big thing. Because that was one thing that always annoyed me about, not annoyed me about the aftermarkets, but people charge a lot of money for this, and I appreciate that a lot of time and effort goes into it. But for me, it's not about that. For me, it's about the community and how we can all come together and we can all make cool stuff together. Everybody's got good ideas, and if we all spend a little bit of time, you know, 2 hands are better than one, or 1,000 hands are better than none. So Callum went home, and he'd set up this website called Forbes Automotive, and I didn't think much of it. Everything at that time was all hand built. I would come home and I'd be buying, you know, 100 resistors at a time, or 10 PCBs at a time, and it was all managed on an old Excel spreadsheet. And it was difficult. I didn't think it would really amount to much. And in the background, Callum was working on editing all the videos and social media and replying to all the messages, because it became quite popular. And I remember that, you know, trying to think of other things that I could make. And the chap that does all the engine conversions up here in Scotland, he'd needed tacho converters, so how you would convert old tachometers. And he'd lent me a cluster, And he said, oh, it'd be cool if you could build some form of tackle converter. So did a bit of Googling, and there is DIY options out there. It lists the components that you need, and it lists how you would go around building it. So I'd done a little bit of digging. I'd prototyped up a couple of boards. They came to the house. I sat and soldered them all together and tested it on the cluster, and it worked. So that went onto the website. And I always remember I'd spun, and it was this exact cluster, I'd spun it round because I was looking at the circuit board on the back, just like you do, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could get the speedo to work? So then I started to make up models, and I'd ordered a couple of motors, and this wasn't even for a product. This was just me going down a rabbit hole for a car I don't even own, and I thought it would be cool if I could make that speedo work. And I don't know why, because I would have sat here tonight and went, oh, that speedo spins. And nobody would, I don't even own a Mark II. Nobody would have been interested. So I'd modelled it, posted about it online, and people said, no, that would be cool. That'd be really nice to have. So spent a little bit of my own money, bought a handful of motors, 3D printed a handful of couplers, and they are as popular as ever. People have fitted them to old Fords, old Fiats, Mark II Escorts, old Mercs. There's loads of old British cars. They went onto Minis, they went onto Jags. You know, originally I thought it would just be Volkswagen based, and it's not. And this is what I want. It's this whole community driven, let's build cool shit for everybody. So that was the tackle and the speedo sorted. And then I thought, well, some people might fit a new engine into a Mark I and a Mark II or whatever it might be. Let's build a controller for that. So then I'd made the Pro version. And at the back of my mind, I thought, well, people might not have a speedometer input, so I'll need to add GPS. And this was just me just rolling stuff off. Oh, it would be cool if I could add GPS. So I'd modelled up a couple of PCBs, and they turned up, and I sat and soldered them all and wrote thousands of lines of code. And in the background, Callum was plugging away at the social media side of it. So now we've got the Speed Pulsar Pro. And then I thought, oh, it would be cool if we could get an engine management light. Now, bearing in mind, this isn't for a car that I even own, but it would be nice to see a wee flashy light on that. So I'd made up another circuit board, and I'd made up some flashy lights. And I guess where I'm going for this is, it wasn't me and Callum sitting thinking, oh, what ideas can we copy, or what can we come up with that would be unique? It was me just looking at stuff going, that would be a problem I'd like to solve for a car that I don't even own. And, you know, Callum was always very heartfelt. You know, he had a reasonably troubled childhood, and he eventually moved into the Scottish Ambulance Service, ultimately to save people's lives. He would handle calls, make sure people were okay, and he would dispatch the necessary resources. And very much like myself, I'm very much a people pleaser. I'll put myself out before I'll look after other people before I look after myself. And between, the three of us, we all had a similar mindset. And I guess that's where Forbes Automotive started from. Because to me, it's not all about the money. It's all about the community. And, it's nice to go to a car show to say, I made this, and I did this with this idea, and we can all come together and build just cool things. And it's nice just to sit back just for, 15, 20 minutes, sit and have an apple juice and just think about the guy that believed in me. And now over, what's been now nearly two and a bit years, we've come together to create a brand that people keep coming back to keep purchasing more things. Because yes, there are more expensive options out there, but ultimately, because we've got that community and people are suggesting and making improvements as time goes on, the products are getting better. And the products that already exist on the shelf for these other things, they don't have the kind of updates that we're producing. And I guess that's why they're slightly different. So it's not going to be a particularly long video. It's not very interesting. But I just wanted to spend a little bit of time, just introduce myself, explain how much Callum meant to me. Because he did. He wasn't just a business partner. Callum was the person that believed that I could be someday, because I didn't. I just used to sit on forums thinking nobody would be interested in any of this. And Callum wasn't. Callum was the opposite. He said, Adam, people are interested. People do want to see what you can make. And he believed in me. And it's sad that he's now no longer with us, but I want to do him as proud. I want him to look down and say, I am proud of you. So to that brother, see you on the other side. It's a very tasty apple juice.